All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to season 2 of Open Hardware TV, episode 1, our first episode here in January. Happy New Year to everyone. And what we're going to do is have a recap of calendar year 2020 and the progress we made with the Open Hardware Group. And we're going to start that off with a fireside chat where Nitin Dahad from embedded.com will join me. And then we'll have a recap of all of the different episodes that we ran through season 1 and the topics that we covered. So stay tuned for that. First up, here comes the fireside chat.
Well, thanks, Rick, for having me on. The last time we met was probably exactly a year ago in Bologna at the High Performance Computing Conference.
Right, at High Peak. That actually was my last trip before all the fun started.
Well, I did also get to Embedded World straight afterwards. So I did CES and then Bologna and then Embedded World, and then that was it.
Yeah, we pulled the plug the week before Embedded World, unfortunately. On to bigger and better things this year, hopefully.
Yes. So let's talk about Open Hardware Group. Well, I know you want to sort of do a little review of what's happened in 2020, but can you tell us maybe, first of all, what level of membership you're at in terms of numbers, and also what you're aiming to reach in the near future?
Sure. Well, I think, as you know, I believe you were at the event, the launch event that we had in Zurich in June of 2019, where we announced the creation of the Open Hardware Group. And that summer, we had around 18 to 20 companies at the table, helping us define the governance framework and membership agreements and bylaws and everything to get ready to start the Open Hardware Group. And we finished that work over the summer and into the fall, and actually started with 19 companies coming out of 2019. And the board of directors had a goal for me during 2020 to double that, go from basically 20 to 40 companies by the end of 2020. Okay. And we actually hit 60 members and partners. Thank you. Yeah, 60 members and partners by the end of the year, and we expect to be at 100 at the end of 2021. So it's been some pretty rapid growth, and effectively in our first year of operation, we got to 60. And the first year, just as a data point, to show the kind of momentum that is behind these open hardware initiatives. The first year of operation, when I was running the RISC-V Foundation, we were at 42. Okay. So it's an interesting, just an interesting comparison, I think.
And I just want to pick up on one thing you said, and you said members and partners. Now, the difference is members do something specific, and partners are there to help the system. Is that right?
Yeah, so we distinguish between members and partners who, exactly the way you described it. A member would have a plan to contribute something, whether it's open source IP or tools or something that would actually be contributed to the ecosystem and remain within the ecosystem, as opposed to support infrastructure and enabling infrastructure that helps the projects execute, but it does not become part of the open source artifacts within the Open Hardware Group ecosystem.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about some of the key milestones that the Open Hardware Group has achieved in the last 6 to 12 months. I know we've had coronavirus and the pandemic since about March in pretty much most of the world. So have you managed to achieve some good milestones, and B, what are they?
Yeah, we were kind of wondering what, like everybody, what would happen to these kinds of projects. But when you think about it, whether this is an individual company, with a distributed workforce globally, in different campuses, or a collaborative engineering project like what we're trying to execute with an Open Hardware Group, those challenges are very similar, right? You've got distributed workforce. They're all now working from home, if you will, all trying to access the CAD infrastructure that they have. And that's actually what, the very essence of pulling together an open source community like we've built in the Open Hardware Group ecosystem. So from that standpoint, it's gone very well. You know, we do everything on GitHub. The project teams use their own existing CAD infrastructure and clone or replicate our GitHub repos into their environment to execute whatever tasks they've been assigned to create either test stimulus or run some simulations and what have you, and contribute to the projects. So from a work infrastructure standpoint, that part has gone pretty well. And the focus for the year was on taking the risky core, which was contributed by the ETH Zurich team, which we call that core the CV32 E4, an embedded class 4-stage core. That's part of our Core 5 family. But take that core, run it through an industrial grade verification methodology so that it's, you know, it's just improved from a verification standpoint beyond what you would typically expect, you know, a university-based core to be. So we've hardened the core, if you will. We built a platform, system Verilog UVM-based step and compare verification platform called the Core 5 Verification Test Bench, which we'll reuse on other RISC-V cores as well, and ran the CV32E4 through that verification methodology and achieved what we call RTL freeze. So froze the RTL with a fully verified, coverage-driven verification methodology. And this is easily an industry first. It's not something that, first of all, collaborative engineering from distributed members across different companies, verifying to commercial quality standards for high volume SoC production, an open source core that is being used and designed into high volume SoCs now that it's been released. And we did that basically started it in the spring after we sort of got ourselves organized post lockdowns, and executed that over the summer and achieved RTL freeze late in 2020.
Right. I do remember when we last met, you talked about hardening the core. And I think, that was one of the key objectives when I first talked to you about the Open Hardware Group. So I think, I guess, that's quite important. And then, it helps to sort of move on and then get that sort of widespread adoption, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a bunch of barriers to entry for adoption of open source hardware to begin with. And certainly one of them is quality, right? I use this analogy a lot. Are you going to walk into your boss's office? If you work in a high volume chip company, SoC company, you want to walk into your boss's office and throw down bet your badge on this, this IP block that you downloaded from a GitHub repo. And say, yeah, boss, we're ready to go. This is a cool core from a university, and we should put it in our high volume SoCs. 2 thumbs up, let's go. So, we felt that it was quite important to have quite visible, open verification flow that people can use and see the quality of the results that the ecosystem has achieved, and produce what would be expected by a high volume SoC company if they were doing it totally on their own.
Yes, I think, and that's always been the challenge for RISC-V, I guess, is, sort of people weren't really sure whether they'd have the tools, the support, and, whether it was serious enough, I guess, in very crude terms.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things there. And, as you know, I started the RISC-V Foundation and, spent about 5 years traveling the world trying to educate and grow the adoption of RISC-V, which has, been tremendous. But I used to get this question a lot because people always thought that the foundation, the RISC-V Foundation or that organization was about developing cores. And it's not, right? It's about developing the ISA itself, a series of specifications defining the instruction set architecture. And then there's all kinds of different adoption options, commercial, open source, closed source, for-profit, non-profit, written in different languages, depending on what your favorite, logic capture language is. And that all comes with a whole, ranging degree of commercial quality, project hobbyist kind of quality. I mean, you and I could, download the ISA specs today and write up a core and throw it up there on GitHub and say, hey, Rick and Nitin cores are us, or, you should have first spelling, Nitin and Rick cores are us kind of thing, and toss it out there. And that's great. That's fantastic from an innovation standpoint, and lowering the barrier to innovation. But it's not so great from an adoption standpoint. I think you can make a strong argument that too many there is such a thing as too many.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about what you think will achieve in 2021 in terms of key milestones. Obviously, you talked about hardening the core and last year, but what's going to be the big thing this year?
Yeah. So the first year had really two significant, if you will, or fundamental objectives behind the operating aspects of the organization, of the ecosystem. One was defining the methodology. How are we actually going to do this? The hardware industry is not established a development flow for open source hardware. And certainly the open source software community has plenty of examples. So the methodology, the engineering release methodology and the development approach was sort of a, figure it out, work it out as we go, and then actually using it to validate, the first core. So that was pretty significant. And we expect to see a bit of a flywheel effect now, where we're going to have multiple cores at different performance points that we'll be working on over the course of 2021. The most obvious next core to go through this flow is the 64-bit core from the ETH Zurich group called Ariane. We call CVA6 an application class 6-stage core. So that work will be worked on, and there's a 64-bit version of that and a 32-bit version. We expect to do some vector accelerator work that will be attached to that core. We expect to also begin work on SoC interconnect around those cores, as well as different accelerators. Because what we're really trying to work on, Open Hardware Group's not just about RISC-V cores. Certainly the beginning of the ecosystem, is centered around a couple of RISC-V core projects. But what we're really focused on is developing the artifacts that are needed for heterogeneous cluster computing that can be reused in different sizes of SoCs. So clustering different types of cores and accelerators and all the various blocks that you need to build that heterogeneous cluster.
We haven't discussed this before, but this is a prelude to my next question, which is, are we going to see sort of SoCs either in sort of prototype form or some commercial products based on this this year or next year?
Yeah, so two answers to that question. Commercial products for sure from our member companies. They're all working on this, not because it's just fun or they want to hang out with a. We've had some folks refer to people who hang out with the Open Hardware Group as Open Hardware groupies. So not just to be a groupie, but because they have commercial motivation for using these open source artifacts. And we make it very clear that the way that this ecosystem will thrive is if there is a path to commercialization, both for the cores inside SoCs, as well as tools and operating systems and so on, support of those for these cores. So for sure there'll be production SoCs from our member companies, and they'll announce those when they're ready. Okay. But we'll also be building our own eval platforms and with different SoCs around these cores. So Global Foundries is a member, and we've already announced the Core 5 MCU, which will use the embedded 4-stage core, the CV32. E4, and we'll build a tiny MCU in global 22 FDX and tape out that this year in 2021 and produce somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 eval kits.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah, it'll be pretty cool, right? Sorry to sort of just keep jumping in on that, but the whole point is we want to look and feel like the experience that you would expect if you were licensing a commercial quality core. You would get the RTL, the verification infrastructure, the tool support, and you could even take it for a test drive on an eval kit before you started playing with it. And that's the whole point of going basically from RTL to gates or to silicon in the flow, and have all of that tool infrastructure available for members to adopt in their own flow.
Right. And that sort of leads me on to the next question. I mean, to what extent is the open source development split between FPGAs and SoCs? Is there a sort of leaning more towards one? I guess FPGA would be the obvious. And you've envisaged any shift in the future in terms of how people develop using this?
Right. So
several questions there.
No, it's good. The RTL is structured from the get-go as a silicon target, so targeted for SoCs.
Okay.
Having said that, we have FPGA bring up in support of that development, from an emulation standpoint, if you will, for all of the cores that we work on. And we also have projects where we are producing soft cores out of that RTL that will be FPGA optimized. So if you want to embed one of these little tiny cores into an FPGA array, you can. And part of that is going back to the heterogeneous cluster enablement that I talked about. A big part of that will be embedded FPGA in a lot of these SoCs. That sits alongside application processors and maybe purpose-built accelerators that are hardened into silicon, with also an embedded FPGA array that is able to accommodate soft cores in some kind of an array or a cluster for purpose-built ML and AI-based acceleration.
Interesting. One of the things I think maybe, and I don't know if it's just the media or whether it's actually the industry, they tend to sort of focus on one architecture or the other. But what I've discovered, both when I sort of came to Zurich for the ETH event, but also in Bologna last year, was there's very much in market, there's very much an approach to heterogeneous compute. And people are using different architectures. And I think, I don't know if tell me, is it the media, or is industry sometimes just too focused on saying, I need to look at this architecture or I need to look at that architecture?
Yeah, that's a really interesting discussion topic, I think. And when I was running, maybe an extended one. But when I was running the RISC-V Foundation, to be honest, I got frustrated a lot by different folks in the media or analyst community insisting that this is an exclusive OR kind of proposition, specifically about ARM as an example.
Yes.
And it's like, look, no, give your head a shake. There are so many computing challenges that can't be addressed by the same, approach that we've had historically, and which will require purpose-built platforms that address the data payload that you're trying to deal with accelerators or different types of clusters. So heterogeneous clusters, it's not a new thing. RISC-V helps to make it a little easier, perhaps, but we expect to see a bunch of the cores that we're working on in a heterogeneous platform that might be leveraging ARM application processors as an example. And the ARM infrastructure, the ARM AMBA infrastructure, which we think is the right infrastructure to support from an SoC standpoint. So I was never a proponent of the exclusive OR kind of thought process. I just don't think that that's practical or realistic in terms of leveraging the very good work as an example that's been done by ARM for decades.
Yep.
And then taking advantage of the fact that you can tune these purpose-built accelerators using a flexible ISA alongside it.
Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but so
please do.
Is it the media to blame?
I don't know if there's blame. I mean, there's certainly people in industry that would also articulate that, okay, this is the new thing, and therefore everything else that came before it is wrong,
right.
And would be proponents of that. But definitely, the media likes sensational headlines and so on, if you will. I mean, try to catch the attention.
Can take it.
So I don't know that you ever frustrated me with the exclusive OR discussion. Maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Good. So what role has the RISC-V ISA played in all of the momentum behind? I think that's an obvious answer to that, but I just, what has it played in terms of the momentum behind the open source hardware movement? And is there, actually, no, it's not an obvious answer. Is there something more that's coming for open hardware?
As I said earlier when we were talking about my history with the foundation itself, one of the questions I got quite a bit was, hey, you RISC-V guy, where's my core? And clearly, the foundation didn't have a core to promote or sanction as the implementation. And the analogy, there's many, which is good. Good from a barrier to innovation standpoint, but potentially bad from an adoption standpoint. But there's I think a very good analogy with the Linux kernel itself, and then multiple distributions that implement that kernel. If you think of the ISA as the Linux kernel analogy or equivalent from a hardware standpoint, and then a whole bunch of implementations, be they commercial and proprietary closed source or open source implementations, as the distributions, as the Ubuntu or CentOS or whatever distributions associated with that. I think the ISA has played a key role. The existence of a free and open ISA has played a key role at unleashing a new, innovation frontier, if you will, from a hardware standpoint. And it's made it accessible for Nitin and Rick to stitch a core together. No agreements to sign with anybody. Download the ISA specs and away we go. Have at it. So from that standpoint, it's been a key enabler. And if you cast your mind back or go look at some of the archives to 20 years ago, at the very beginning, there were many, many implementations around the Linux kernel, far more than we have today. And our challenge from a hardware industry is, how do we get to the 5 or 6 families, like there are now, 5 or 6 relevant distributions for Linux? How do we get to the 5 or 6 families of core implementations around RISC-V that will be sustainable? Because achieving critical mass in the ecosystem to support the necessary few of implementations is what the next challenge is. And that's part of what we're trying to tackle in the Open Hardware Group ecosystem.
Wow, it's not like a 6-month thing. I think it's going to be maybe a bit longer.
Quite a bit.
Let's move on. In the long term, will we see effective open source verification environments materialize, which are free to use? I suppose it's taking that whole analogy, model further. So does it go to verification, and then where does it go? Where does it end up?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because we get I take it on the chin from sort of the open source purists that if everything isn't open source, then nothing is. And our projects are structured to make it easy for high volume commercial adoption. And so if you say that that's a goal for the Open Hardware Group ecosystem, then you can start eliminating a bunch of options pretty much right out of the gate. And one of them is you just need to look at the majority of the volume of silicon around the world that's in production today. More than 95% of that volume was produced and verified in a system Verilog-based tool flow and verification infrastructure, commercial verification infrastructure for that production release. So if we want someone to adopt the cores, they need to be easily stitched into that commercial tool flow.
Yes.
The NXPs and Silicon Labs of the world and other SoC companies have a system Verilog UVM-based verification environment. We are not going to try to teach them or convince them to use something different. If we really want RTL adoption, of these open source blocks, they just need to drop into that flow. It's almost a fireable offense at an SoC company to come in and suggest that you're going to break the CAD tool chain that is a known good tool chain to get to first pass success. So we think it's interesting for the different projects that are out there around CAD tools and open sourcing CAD tools, open sourcing PDKs, all of those things that are underway. That's not a problem that we're trying to solve. If those tools become mature enough and are adopted by the high volume SoC producers, then that'll change our focus. But right now we embrace the commercial tools and we leverage the commercial tools, and that's because that's what our ecosystem membership uses to go to production.
Just to conclude, I still remember a panel I think I did coordinated at Electronica a few years ago, and one of the panelists I think basically said open source doesn't necessarily mean free because we've all got to make money. Yeah,
I mean, the reality of it is, let's just, again, we have so much to learn from just observing what's transpired in the software, open source software flow, right? IBM bought Red Hat for $31 billion. That's not a small, that's a significant chunk of change, right? For me, I like to try to simplify my thought process and separate things into clarity versus certainty. We don't know with certainty what the business model and economic environment will look like for open source hardware in 2 years and 5 years. But I think we do have some clarity around the fact that there's momentum behind this open hardware initiative globally, and it will change. So what are some of the things that we can do and share within the ecosystem, within the industry that is meaningful and impactful, while leveraging what we need to, the best tool for the job commercially to support these implementations. And that's sort of the approach, right? That we're not trying to boil the ocean with one match. We can collectively work on solving a part of the problem that is relevant and meaningful for the members, the part of the ecosystem that wants to adopt it, and then go from there.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we'll end. Thanks very much, Rick.
No, thank you, Nitin. Good discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed those questions from Nitin. Certainly lots of provocative topics that we went through. Now we're going to have a quick recap of the various episodes and topics that we covered in season 1 of Open Hardware TV, including the verification environment we executed, the open source RISC-V cores that we have in our Core 5 family, the work underway in the hardware and software task groups, and the Core 5 MCU project that we have underway, and of course, the culminating work around our 32-bit core and the RTL freeze milestone that we achieved. So thank you all very much for your support over the course of 2020, and look forward to more progress in 2021. Steve, if I'm a new viewer watching this episode and I'm really intrigued by the verification work that we're doing, this test bench just looks super cool, and I want to participate, how do I get involved?
Well, we're extremely visible. As has been mentioned often, we have our GitHub repos. Those are a great place for you to just go look, see what we're doing, see how well the code we are developing has been put together, what it looks like. And if you're ready to contribute, please look us up at the openhwgroup.org, the Open Hardware Group.
I'm going to share my screen to give everyone a look at what Open Hardware members see when they log into metrics. So this is our dashboard screen, and this is actually live results for the CV32 core, which is under development at Open Hardware and is in the process of the verification and eventually will be into coverage closure.
All of the low-level details of the core are kept down at the bottom in the test bench module. So if you have, for example, specific interfaces for interrupts or a specific memory controller interface that you need to connect to, that is handled down at the lowest levels, and that is difficult to customize.
The challenge always with all testing is how do you know that the device you've built does what you expect it to do? So somehow, somewhere, you've got to be comparing your RTL with something, whether it's formal and all the complexities of that, or you have to have a reference, or you have to write extremely careful directed tests. But I think, the last 25 years of hardware DV has told us that you need many different approaches to verification. And from a dynamic simulation point of view, you basically do directed tests where each test carefully checks what's going on, or you use a reference and compare it.
Of course, we actually do the work in this task group. So it means that we will plan and coordinate the development efforts for these core IPs. And in the end, of course, the goal is to deliver open source production quality IP cores. So that means that we work tightly together with the verification task group and with the software task group. In the course task group, we contribute to make sure that we get the features that we want at, let's say, at the power performance and area costs that are interesting to our products.
At TELES, we have surveyed the need of our users, and it turned out that Ariane was our priority. We want to have a verified vendor independent core. We like both flavors, 32-bit and 64-bit of CVA6, and we want to target both ASIC optimized and FPGA optimized versions. And as a vice chair of the course task group, I will be more dedicated to leading the Ariane-related tasks with open hardware participants and maybe new participants interested in CVA6.
So the idea of Pulp is creating a multi-core to achieve high performance, running at near threshold to achieve low power. And as you can see here in the architecture, you see that there are many IPs, and the main ones we can say are the microprocessors, the cores that are running the applications.
So there is no formal definition of an application class core, but as a minimum, I would say it should run an operating system, and it should be user programmable so that the user can launch different tasks and the operating system takes care of the underlying hardware and scheduling the tasks. What this means in RISC-V terms is that the processor should implement parts or most of the privileged specification.
The objective with the software task group is summed up in our two goals. The first is this will only work if we have a viable commercial ecosystem for software to actually encourage companies to actually create software that is suitable for Core 5.
Chief goal of the hardware task group is to support hardware implementations of the Open Hardware Group cores by defining, developing, and supporting SOCs, FPGAs, and evaluation development platforms, leveraging both proprietary and open source tools, and this for the cores and IP developed within the group.
I might be asked why I came to the Open Hardware group. I think there are two challenges for the RISC-V architecture at present. One is production, and the second is software ecosystem.
So what do we need for Core 5? There is currently a generic RISC-V toolchain upstream. And by upstream, I mean the official distribution of the GNU tools. So official GCC, official bin utils.
A second solution which we have is the Open Hardware IDE for Core 5. So this is very similar, except that it's a freely available open source development environment created by the Open Hardware group. It's also an Eclipse-based IDE for Core 5 development.
You know, we understand use cases for embedded FPGA, but we don't think the whole world does. How can we put more proofs out there, more clouds for research to have papers that actually can inspire more use of this in the future?
We care about energy efficiency, and we also care about economic efficiency, because we want to be shooting for IoT kind of applications where people need relatively low-cost products. So 22FDX, it's an SOI-based technology. So that means that you have the option of dynamically switching between performance and power savings. So you can just imagine that's very useful in this environment.
Brian West, we'll transition to you now. And this, so far, what we're talking about here today is, you know, turning that research project into a production quality SOC and leveraging that open source development. You're kind of the different character in this panel from the investment community with ARK Investments, a private equity investor. What's motivating you to invest in open source hardware development?
For us, it's really a simple bet on edge IoT being a power game and a mass customization game. So the only, you know, why everybody's going from an investment standpoint, you know, you can look at the NVIDIA deal with ARM as the most recent example towards, you know, deeper and deeper domain expertise. We're sort of taking the opposite approach where all the innovation is going to happen in a shallow, very quick end-to-end turnaround for an SoC. And I think where that game is won is in the ultra low power settings.
This is absolutely perfect technology for Core 5 MCU development, not just today, but even for the future generation, because this gives you enough juice in the technology as of now to not just develop for today's MCU, but also for edge IoT applications going forward, where you see more and more of AI coming in picture.
I'll walk everybody through the environment, and we'll go from your left to your right. Off on the left-hand side is where all the stimulus is created. These are usually in the form of test programs. These are either generated by hand, so a human writes a program, C or assembly, or we use the Google instruction set generator. You may know it as RISC-V DV.
We also carried out deadlock analysis to prove that core doesn't lock up. So we've picked up issues in all aspects of specification, design, glitches in our own test bench, and we validated the results with all of the main formal verification tools that we have in-house, from Cadence Metagraphics and Synopsys.
One thing Formal is really good at is establishing that there's nothing in your core that you don't want it to be there, be it instructions, registers, or of course the weird side effects that could be backdoors for your hackers. So that's why we at OneSpin built a solution around processors and RISC-V in particular. Quite a few nifty automations in there. Let's focus on what we have actually done here in this particular project.
The functional coverage for me is really the huge value, is that, you know, you can write one line of RTL and write something that covers that, and you have 100% code coverage. It doesn't mean you've actually tested anything. Right? So code coverage is worthwhile. It definitely needs to be 100%, but it definitely doesn't give you the full picture.
We're really, really lucky, really blessed to have a very large community of contributing members that are actively contributing to Core 5 Verif really on a daily basis. We've got silicon vendor organizations, academic organizations, design services organizations, all coming in to help us achieve the goal of having best-in-class Core 5 IP available to the market.
In a nutshell, we do have an end-to-end vendor-neutral solution for formal verification. We have about 27,000 properties, including coverage targets, covering user and privileged ISA. We do have extensive set of deadlock checks, protocol checks for I-side and D-side and X checks. We don't have any inconclusive proofs. We don't have that problem that a lot of people have, but we have invested in heavy engineering to make sure we don't have that problem.
And of course, the other thing that Formal can give you on the exhaustive side is actually a proof that there is no other functionality in your core, which is something you just cannot really achieve in simulation-only flows.
Right. Okay. Thank you, gentlemen, for taking those questions. And thank you to all the attendees for attending. This is the final episode of season 1 for Open Hardware TV. We'll be back on the air with season 2 in January. And as the guys alluded to, there's a lot of verification talks at the RISC-V Summit coming up in the second week of December. We have a number of Open Hardware Group talks, as well as a virtual booth that includes some of the member companies from the Open Hardware Group ecosystem. So if you haven't checked out the the RISC-V Summit yet, please do so. And we'll be hoping to see you there. And thank you again for attending today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.